on the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Good evening. Thank you so much for tuning in to tonight's edition of Open Line. Tonight we are joined by two co-founders of Tennessee Voices for Victims. Will you guys start by just introducing yourselves and tell us a little bit about your nonprofit?
Sure. My name is Verna Wyatt, and I'm one of the co-founders. And Valerie and I have worked together for decades in victim advocacy. And in 2012, we formed Tennessee Voices for Victims, and it's been a great ride.
It has been a great ride, yes. My name is Valerie Craig, and I'm also one of the co-founders. And Tennessee Voices for Victims, you know, we started it because what we realized is that victims, a lot of times, a couple of different things. One, once they've kind of gone through the system, once they've experienced criminal justice and they've had that experience, they want to do something with that. They know the pain and the difficulty of having to rebuild their lives. And so they want other people to kind of glean from their experiences. And then the other aspect of why Tennessee Voices came into being is because for advocates, one of the things that really kind of sets us apart is that we really believe that if we want to be serious about ending victimization, that we need to work with the people who are actually causing the victimization. And so for us at Tennessee Voices, that means that we actually go into the prisons and work with individuals who are incarcerated to help them learn how to change the choices that they're making.
What are some of the things prisoners say to you after victims come in and speak with them?
Well, you know, it's really interesting, and Verna can share a little bit about her own story, just really briefly, but actually they have an opportunity every week to have one of their facilitators be a survivor. That's how Verna ended up being in this field. But you know, when they hear individuals who come in, they're always taken aback by the honesty in which survivors are willing to share with them. And in a lot of cases, they will even be like, they'll say to us after the survivor leaves, they're like, do they know why I'm in here? You know, did they understand that I'm in here because I robbed somebody, or, you know, whatever crime the survivor was coming in to talk about? And what we always just say to them is, you know, they do understand that, but they also believe that you have the ability to change, and they want to use their story and their voice to encourage you to do that. They don't want you to be in here. They don't want you to be causing more victims. They don't want you to go out and just pick up where you left off. They want you to go out and change your life. We have even had individuals, just recently we had a gentleman who came in and shared about his son who was in a drunk driving crash here in the Middle Tennessee area several years ago now. And he shared his story, and by the end of his time in that class, the class actually got up and prayed for him. You know, I mean, so there's this connection that begins to happen between the survivor and those who are incarcerated.
Have you guys been able to tell if this helps with recidivism rates or keeping people out from prison and jail?
Well, it's hard to know whether one program does that or not. For example, we've been working with Men of Valor for the last 14 years. Every year we've been going into their program teaching incarcerated men, and they have a great recidivism rate. So we feel like we're a little part of that. But what we do know is that their attitudes change. They begin to look at things that they thought were okay, that they did every day, that were victimizing behaviors that they thought were normal. All of a sudden now they realize, oh, you know, that's had an impact on somebody. So we know that because we have pre and post tests that we do on them. And we also know that it begins their own journey of understanding their behavior. Because as victim advocates, what really made an impression on me and Valerie when we began teaching victim impact, it didn't take us very long before we realized we had a classroom full of people that had so many of the crimes experiences that we rush out to minister to every day. And the only difference is they don't realize that it was an impact. I mean, it's nothing for people in our class to have multiple people that they love murdered. And personally, just speaking as someone who's had somebody murdered, that put me on the ground for a long, long time. you don't get over something like that. It has an impact on you. And so many of the women that are in our class have multiple rapes. And we know what just one rape does to a woman. But here are women that have had to endure multiple rapes, and they look at it like, that's just the way it is in my world. That's just what happens. And when we talk about these crimes and they begin to identify with them, they understand that a lot of their behavior, their negative behavior, is attached to their trauma. And that's not an excuse. And that used to make me mad as an advocate. I don't want to hear about their behavior. I don't care what happened to them, because I know lots of people that had horrible things happen and they don't go out and hurt other people like that. Well, that's true, and I don't understand why. Why some people can rise above and others sink. I don't understand that, but I know that it happens. And if people are walking around wounded from past trauma and they don't even realize it, they're just going to continue hurting other people.
As a victim, do you think it's empowering for you and other victims to go into these prison or jail settings and talk to suspects about that pain?
Well, you know, personally, that's one of the things that got me started in victim advocacy. When my sister-in-law was raped and murdered, I could barely stand it. It was suffocating, the pain and the grief and the frustration and the anger, suffocating. And I began speaking out, and that gave me a sense that I could take that horrible, awful thing I couldn't control and maybe bring something positive from it. And I think most victims do that. And I think that's really why Valerie and I started this agency. We want to give victims a voice. That anger, that bitterness, that frustration, you have to have an outlet for it. Otherwise, it's going to make you sick.
For victims who might be watching tonight, please feel free to call in if you have any questions for our guests. But what is some of your advice to victims who might be struggling, or family members of victims? What are some tips to help them through this time?
One of the biggest things, get counseling. And you know, people think that if you go to counseling, it's not going to help, or that maybe you're weak. But when you have a traumatic event like murder or rape or even like kidnapping, you need someone to walk you through it.
Right. Well, counseling, you know, counseling isn't designed to fix what happened, and I think that that's the sense a lot of times when you have these kind of traumas. You know, the human spirit wants to be fixed. We want to go back to what that experience or what our lives were like prior to the trauma, and there's just nothing that takes you back to what it was prior to that. But what counseling does is it gives you the tools to help you navigate that trauma and to rebuild your life so that it can be, you know, stronger in those broken places. You know, a lot of times you'll hear the analogy from victims who will say, you know, being a victim is like having a really horrible wound, and you know that for that wound to heal, you've got to clean it out, you've got to go to the doctor, you've got to do what the doctor tells you to do, take your medicine, all of those different kinds of things. And eventually, if you follow all of that, you know, it'll heal over, but you're going to have a scar there. And that's very much like what victimization is. That wound, that skin doesn't go back exactly the way that it was prior to the injury. Your life doesn't go back exactly the way it was prior to the victimization, but counseling by far is the thing. And in Nashville, I mean, we always say, if you are going to be a victim of crime, being able to do it in the Middle Tennessee area,
especially Davidson County,
it's crazy to say it's a blessing, but this is where the resources are. We have lots of counseling and victim advocates who are just, you know, angels at their jobs, because they truly help meet people at really their greatest need and help them rebuild those lives. Victim intervention program, and several other ones that are out there that are available to survivors.
We were talking before the show just about these victim and perpetrator reconciliation meetings. What do you guys know about what is happening here in Davidson County, where maybe it's the victim is meeting with the offender?
Well, if the offender is incarcerated in the Tennessee prisons, they have the opportunity to request a meeting, and if
the victim does, it's a victim-driven program. If
the offender agrees to it, then they go through a process with 2 trained facilitators, and both Valerie and I have been trained, where you meet with both parties for several months to ready them for the eventual meeting. And I've facilitated one of those meetings, and it was very intense. It was a young man who his father was murdered when he was a baby, and he grew up hating that man. And when he was 18, he called for an offender dialogue, and luckily his offender agreed to do it. And so we went through the process, and he was just full of anger and bitterness and hatred. And when they finally came together, the meeting lasted about 3 hours, and he said to the offender at the end, he said, "I can't say I'm ready to forgive you, but I can say you're not the monster I thought you were all these years." And it was a benefit for the offender. He felt like a weight had been lifted off of him. And even today, the young man that went through the process said it just changed everything. He didn't have that hatred in his heart anymore. He wasn't thinking about, vengeance. He just felt a peace that he had never had before, just coming together. There's something about humanizing people and talking to people on face to face that changes everything.
And being able to express yourself, in so many of these cases, especially when you're talking about these high-level victimizations, what the victim wants to know is why. Why did this happen? Why was this allowed to happen?
And they have a lot of other questions too.
Sure, it's just all of those unanswered things, and to have the opportunity to sit down with the person who put all of that into action. It's a really unique opportunity for them to express themselves, and it's a really unique opportunity for the individual who was convicted of the crime to really get there was an impact here. That's really where our behavior changes, is when we understand impact. That's when we're going to know that's when we're going to be much more inclined to decide, what, I don't ever want to cause that level of pain again. Or conversely, if we've done something really good, we think, I want to do that again. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea behind some of that.
And then there's also a restorative justice movement in Nashville, and Valerie and I are fortunate enough to be a part of that, working with Travis Claybrooks, who is the CEO of Rafa Institute. And Valerie, you can say a little bit.
Well, the Juvenile Restorative Justice Project, this is, it is grassroots, but it is something that is really kind of coming in from other states, that there are some other states in our country who are doing this. And the idea is that juveniles have the opportunity, because of brain development, to learn things a little bit differently than us adults. And so the idea is that if we can intervene with them with some of these lower level crimes, so things like car theft, that kind of thing, which is a huge impact. Somebody steals my car. If I go out into the parking lot and somebody has stolen my car, that's going to be a huge impact. But it's not obviously to the level of murder or robbery or something that's on that personal level. If we can intervene with these young folks at these lower levels, then maybe we have the opportunity to truly keep them out of the system long term, so that we don't see some of the other things that we see sometimes here in Nashville with murders and that type of stuff. And so the idea is that if a young person commits one of these crimes and the victim agrees, once again, this is a victim-driven program, which is why we as advocates are willing to support it. If it wasn't victim-driven, we would not be willing to do that. But the victim gets to decide if they want to participate in this process or not. And if they choose to do that, then they will have a dialogue themselves with the juvenile who committed the crime in their life. And that is a process. There's a lot of meetings with both sides. You have to get the juvenile ready, you have to get the survivor ready to come in and have that be healthy for both of them. But it's very survivor driven. The survivor gets to come in and the survivor gets to decide, working with the juvenile, what does justice mean to them? What does it mean? You stole my car. Maybe you took it on a joyride and totally totaled it. You might not be able to repay me the value of that car, but maybe there are other ways that we can come through dialogue to get to a sense of justice. And in that particular case, or those cases, I should say, the victim has a lot of control. I mean, it seems really counterintuitive to remove that out of the criminal justice system like that. But the victim actually is the one that's really calling the shots at that particular point. They get to make a lot of decisions along the way. They get to voice their emotional impact, which would not be something that they would get to do typically in the court system. And they get to have people surround them and say, we understand where you're coming from. We understand the difficulty that you're facing, and how can we come alongside you and help you through this process.
Thank you so much for sharing your hearts. We do have to head to a commercial break, but please call us with your questions and we'll answer them right after this.